Well, first tonight, the Chinese city of Guangzhou remains tense after protesters clashed with police in ongoing demonstrations against COVID restrictions. Guangzhou is a sprawling port city north of Hong Kong in Guangdong province. These videos on social media show demonstrators throwing stones at dozens of riot police in all-white pandemic gear, holding shields over their heads, and obviously you can't see those pictures, but following the disturbances, the authorities in Guangzhou swiftly lifted COVID restrictions, including an end to mass PR testing. It follows days of extraordinary unrest in the country that also prompted international demonstrations in solidarity. Western nations have urged China not to harm or intimidate protesters opposing COVID-19 lockdowns. Meanwhile, the leadership in Beijing is mourning former President Jiang Zemin, who's died at the age of 96. Mr. Jiang took power in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square crackdown, in which the military used deadly force to end the uprising. He led China towards its emergence as a global economic powerhouse, and Chinese state media is tonight hailing him as a great communist revolutionary. Our chief correspondent, John Cooksoon, has been looking back at his life and legacy.
When Jiang Zemin replaced Deng Xiaoping as leader in 1989, China was still in the early stages of economic modernization. By the time he retired in 2003, he'd forged a formidable economy. The communists had tightened their grip, and China was a major player on the world stage. Jiang Zemin's legacy, though, remains mixed and his critics numerous.
The People's Liberation Army turned their guns on the people in downtown Beijing, ending nearly 2 months of student democracy protests.
After the Tiananmen Square revolt, Jiang Zemin's government stamped out dissent at home. It jailed human rights, labour and pro-democracy activists and banned the Falun Gong spiritual movement, which it viewed as a threat to the Communist Party's monopoly on power. China watchers thought Jiang Zemin would be a transitional leader. Instead, he proved to be transformative. During his time in power, he sought to strengthen ties with the US, visiting the country several times and offering the then President George W. Bush cooperation in Washington's war on terror following the 9/11 attacks. And Russia's President Putin was an old friend, those early meetings laying the foundation of strong ties between Moscow and Beijing, which exist today. In his years as president, Jiang Zemin was criticized for failing to solve new problems created by China's economic rebirth, namely rampant corruption, inequality, and state sector reforms which caused mass layoffs. By 2019, Jiang Zemin had faded from public sight, and one of his last appearances was alongside current and former leaders at Beijing's Tiananmen Gate. Rumours circulated about arguments between him and the current Chinese President Xi Jinping over policy. But with China's political system being as opaque and secretive as it is, these reports are impossible to verify. China's state media is calling Jiang Zemin a communist hero. History may judge him otherwise. John Cookson, Arise News.
And John Cookson joins us now from London, where he's been monitoring developments. Good to see you, John. Let's start with the latest official reaction to Jiang Zemin's death. What's it been like in China? I understand state media has gone into mourning mode.
Hey, Charles, good to see you. Yes, well, that's very much the story out of China tonight. There's a website which many people in China use called Weibo. And incredibly, Charles, the obituary to this man has been viewed by 700 million Chinese. I mean, that's a mind-blowing figure, and it shows the amount of interest that Chinese have in their leadership. Doesn't mean to say they approve of leadership, of course, and what the Chinese think about the leadership in Beijing at any time is sometimes hard to fathom. but it certainly had an impact in China. However, it couldn't have come at a worse time, the death of a leader for China, which has been racked by unrest since last Thursday over COVID restrictions. And the reason why I say that is that it's the tradition in China, when a leader, president, prime minister dies, for people to take to the streets and to express their worries and concerns and distaste for whatever the government is doing at the time. Now, the last thing that China needs right now, the leadership in Beijing, is more unrest sparked by the death of this former leader. So I imagine that the security forces are working flat out tonight to ensure that the streets across China are safe, because as we've seen in recent days, there have been a lot of protests in the major cities.
And John, I know you mentioned some of this in your package, but the timing of his death with these protests going on is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, what's his death likely to mean for that current outpouring of dissent? Because I understand that the leaders of the country are likely to use this to their advantage, and perhaps flood state media with nationalist sentiment.
It may well do, and we'll have to wait and see what happens in the coming days on this, Charles. But I think the main emphasis now and the main thoughts of President Xi in Beijing is keeping law and order across the country, because, as I say, it is tradition for people to take to the streets and express their dissatisfaction with the way the government is carrying out things, as they have in the past on the death of a leader like a president or a prime minister. So bad timing, if you like, this death. He was, of course, 96 years old. I said that history may judge him differently to how state media is portraying him as a communist hero. Tonight, I mean, frankly, the regime that he ran was a very corrupt one, and it was brutal at times. And certainly, the demonstrations that we've seen about COVID in the last week would not have been tolerated if he'd been in power. The police would have moved in much quicker than they have already.
John, thanks very much indeed. John Cooksoon, Arise chief correspondent, talking to me there about the death of Jiang Zemin, the former Chinese leader.